Welcome to the debate. Imagine trying to download a massive, highly emotional file into a computer, but the receiving port physically melts down if it receives more than, say, 2 lines of code at a time.
The system completely freezes, right? To protect its own motherboard?
Exactly, it just hard crashes. And that is exactly what happens in the neurobiology of intimacy for a highly analytical, twice exceptional mind.
It really is a profound structural paradox. I mean, the exact biological mechanisms that are designed to protect the brain from crashing under pressure, well, they become the very barriers that make human connection feel totally impossible.
Yeah, and that brings us right to the center of our discussion today. We are looking at a very specific cognitive profile. Let's call him the architect.
Right, the AI researcher from the source material.
Exactly. A brilliant mind that operates on strict, capacity-constrained structural logic. So our central question is this: how can highly charged, non-linear relational data, specifically physical and emotional intimacy, be safely communicated to this architect without triggering a system shutdown?
Right, the big question.
Yeah.
Like, can we, and more importantly, should we, use a game-theoretic vection illusion and sequential cognitive scaffolding, the PrEP framework, to just bypass a partner's neurobiological defense mechanisms?
It's a staggering proposition to consider engineering human intimacy this way.
Well, I represent the position that utilizing this vection illusion and the PrEP framework is actually a vital act of cognitive empathy. I mean, it provides the necessary external scaffolding to safely deliver emotional data without triggering a devastating bioenergetic shutdown. And I argue that while this approach might be structurally flawless for bypassing those cognitive bottlenecks, relying on a simulated vection illusion and this sort of asymmetric metabolic sacrifice, it basically risks replacing authentic relational integration with a highly engineered and ultimately unsustainable biological transaction.
Okay, so to understand why this architect shuts down in the first place, we have to look at what is physically happening in their brain under pressure.
The actual neurobiology of it.
Right, because it isn't stubbornness, It is a hard biological bottleneck. If you look at the research by Alvarez and Kavanagh on visual working memory, it shows that as structural complexity spikes, which is exactly what happens during high-stakes emotional conversations, visual working memory capacity just collapses.
It's a huge drop.
Huge. For a mind like our AI researcher dealing with the chaotic, parallel variables of a live partner looking at them and expressing complex needs, their working memory drops to an absolute bottleneck of just 1 to 2 items.
Which is incredibly severe when you're trying to navigate something as complex as a relationship.
It really is. And this isn't just a psychological freeze where they're suddenly at a loss for words. It is a literal metabolic emergency.
Right. The ATP depletion.
Yes. This acute processing demand rapidly depletes the local energy, the ATP, in the prefrontal cortex. And that drop in energy triggers these specific channels in the brain, the KATP channels, which contain KIR 6.2.
The bioenergetic breaks.
Exactly. Think of them as the brain's emergency circuit breakers. When the energy drops too low, they physically pop open, which hyperpolarizes or basically freezes the neuronal membrane. It shuts off the power to prevent permanent damage. The brain literally pulls the plug on the conversation.
To save itself from frying.
Right. So my position is that the only way to deliver intimacy is by preventing those circuit breakers from ever tripping. We have to trigger a vection illusion. We wrap the interaction in a highly technical, non-threatening, game-theoretic frame like a Nash bargaining problem, so the brain glides on autopilot and the data is safely processed without that KTP shutdown.
I mean, I want to acknowledge the brilliant mechanics of what you just described. The reality of those visual working memory limits and the KATP channel circuit breakers is undeniable. But I really have to challenge this idea of the vection illusion as a healthy, long-term solution.
Okay, let's hear it.
Let's unpack what a vection illusion actually is, based on Charnas, Rustaccini, and Van de Ven's work on strategic behavior. If you've ever been sitting on a stationary train, right, and the train on the track next to you pulls away.
You feel like you're moving.
Exactly. Your brain tricks you into feeling like you are the one moving. It is, by definition, an automatic perceptual error.
But it's an error that serves a highly protective purpose here.
Protective, maybe. But at what cost? Treating emotional intimacy like an optimization matrix, saying something like, hey, let's optimize our neurometabolic homeostasis, instead of just saying, I need to feel close to you. Yes, it successfully bypasses their Cartesian blind spot. It definitely tricks their automatic systems.
Right, which is the goal.
But, and this is the core of my issue, it places an extreme, one-sided neurometabolic burden on the partner who is trying to communicate. That partner is forced to act as the astrocyte.
The metabolic division of labor.
Exactly. The astrocyte is the cell that feeds energy to neurons. This partner is continuously running their own internal engine in reverse to fuel this highly engineered fake scenario, just to keep the architect comfortable.
Okay, let me push back on the word fake. You're framing the Vection illusion as a deception, but I look at it as a necessary translation map.
A translation map that relies on an illusion.
Because bounded rationality dictates that calculating optimal behavior for every single unpredictable social interaction is massively expensive for the brain. To save energy, the brain maintains a stock of pre-existing models. For our AI researcher, direct, unmediated emotional demands represent an entirely unmapped, computationally terrifying road.
Sure, it's expensive reflective processing.
Right. If a partner approaches him with raw feelings, his prefrontal cortex panics, sounds the amygdala alarm, and those circuit breakers trip. But analyzing a game-theoretic strategy or a cooperative signaling game, that is his most highly familiar route. His behavior there is automated.
It requires almost zero prefrontal effort for him.
Exactly. So when we frame intimacy as a structural challenge, it's not a trick. Think of it like providing a tactile map to a visually impaired person. It is a highly optimized proxy that translates a chaotic reality into a natively understood format, saving his prefrontal cortex from panic.
Okay, I come at it from a different way. That is a fascinating analogy, the tactile map, but let's look at what's actually happening on the couch in a living room. The Vection illusion operates entirely unconsciously.
Meaning,
if the AI researcher is unconsciously processing physical intimacy because his brain genuinely believes it is debugging a complex logic structure, he isn't actually relating to his partner. He isn't resolving what we call orthogonal remapping friction.
the friction required to merge two distinct contextual environments.
Exactly. Shifting from a clinical programming environment into deep relational space requires a massive remap of the brain's cognitive spaces. If you just trigger his automaticity by acting as a salient perturbation, making him think he's solving an investment problem, he isn't remapping. He is hiding in a familiar cognitive sandbox.
But the data still gets through?
But he thinks he is analyzing a mathematical model rather than experiencing the raw, high-contrast reality of direct human contact. Yes, it bypasses the freeze, but it totally avoids true integration. The passenger never actually steps off the simulated train.
Well, I hear what you're saying about the danger of the illusion, but I would argue that true integration is happening. It is just happening safely, step by step, because of the actual tool sustaining that illusion, the PrEP framework.
Okay, the optical cable.
Yes, the optical cable. We aren't just handing him a math problem and calling it love. We are using point, reason, example point to deliver the non-linear content.
Walk me through what that optical cable looks like in practice, because it sounds exhausting.
It's actually highly efficient. We know from Chung Zhao and Edward Vogel's research that sequential presentation dramatically reduces encoding competition. If you throw all your feelings at the architect at once, the variables compete and the system crashes. So you use PREP.
Breaking it into chunks?
Bite-sized chunks. You lead with a clear point, like, our primary target is establishing a pre-agreed visual sandbox to calibrate sensory alignment.
Very romantic.
Snark all you want, but that phrase gives his central executive an instant retrieval cue. It stops him from scrambling. Then you provide the reason and example, packaging the emotional needs linearly as variables within this cooperative game.
So you're keeping it within that 1 to 2 item visual working memory limit.
Exactly. You prevent the amygdala from hijacking the brain, you stop those KATP channels from tripping, and you close with the point again to lock in the mutual win.
You utilize his own DeepMind hardware to get your basic needs met.
That's a compelling argument, mechanically. I won't deny that using sequential gating to eliminate encoding competition is clever, but have you considered the metabolic division of labor here?
You brought up the astrocyte earlier.
Yes, let's talk about the 2026 NPAS3 astrocyte study. To maintain this prep scaffolding, the communicator, the partner, must entirely take on the role of the astrocyte. They are actively suppressing their own natural emotional expression, running their mitochondrial ATP synthase in reverse, basically sacrificing their own citric acid cycle just to generate this highly refined, pre-digested L-lactate fuel.
So the partner's doing all the bioenergetic heavy lifting?
All of it. They have to physically export this fuel via monocarboxylate transporters just to keep the architect's pyramidal neurons firing. My question is, how long can one human being sustain this grueling dual differentiation before they collapse? Generating the math, structuring the proposals, maintaining the safety frame, having to turn every emotional need into a TED Talk just to be heard.
A TED Talk might actually save the relationship, honestly.
But eventually, that asymmetry collapses into chronic trade anxiety for the supplier. You burn out.
I completely understand why you see it as a drain, but that assumes the astrocytic sacrifice is just this permanent, endless loop of exhaustion. It ignores a fascinating mechanism called the cognitive jackpot.
The Dudman Lab research?
Yes, the 2026 HHMI research from the Dudman Lab. We used to think that skill acquisition and relational adaptation required thousands of slow, tedious repetitions. If that were true, you're right, it absolutely would cause the astrocytic burnout you're describing.
Because every single repetition requires more of that pre-digested L-lactate fuel.
Right. But the Dudman Lab completely disproves that. They prove that a single maximum magnitude reward, like presenting a profound peer-to-peer relational proposal in the architect's native, highly structured scientific language, triggers an extended, high-volume dopamine wave.
A huge spike in the system.
A massive spike. His brain registers it as a massive jackpot. This exerts a one-shot update in his behavioral vigor. It immediately locks his prefrontal attention. And most importantly, for the partner acting as the astrocyte, this jackpot state halts the agonizing photon loss.
The signal degradation.
Yes, it stops it entirely. You establish this equal intellectual footing, and it actually stops the reverse engine from draining the partner.
Look, a one-shot dopamine wave is incredibly powerful. I grant you that. But I seriously question the stability of that transient dopamine spike. We know that mitochondria in the brain operate in two modes, right? You have the activity-evoked mode, which handles acute bursts of transmission like your jackpot, involving complex 1 and 2, and then you have baseline support, which maintains the actual architecture of the circuits over time.
So you're suggesting the jackpot provides a spark, but it doesn't build the permanent wiring.
Exactly. Let's look at the retrosplenial cortex, the RSP. The stability of these circuits relies on perineuronal nets, or PNNs.
The protective mesh around parvobumin interneurons?
Right. Think of PNNs like a trellis that ivy grows on. They protect the neurons from reactive metabolites during high activity. A massive dopamine wave might trigger immediate, thrilling engagement, but does it truly synthesize the baseline mitochondrial support required to maintain those PNNs for long-term relational architecture?
I would argue it does, yes.
Or does it just create a temporary, highly engineered peak? Because if it's just a peak, the partner is doomed to constantly re-stimulate the system. They have to keep manufacturing new, mathematically perfect structural proposals every time they want to feel connected.
That is a fair concern, but let me frame what that baseline actually represents for a twice exceptional profile. The biological constraints we are discussing, the working memory bottleneck, the KATP circuit breakers, these are absolute physical boundaries. They are not emotional choices.
No, they are hardwired.
Right. So when the partner uses the PREP framework and the Vection illusion, they are not just chasing a temporary dopamine peak. They are engaging in the highest form of intellectual charity.
Wow, intellectual charity. That is a very striking way to put it.
It really is what's happening. The partner is absorbing the environmental friction of the relationship by translating basic human needs into a structured, familiar schema.
They are giving his central executive the exact tool it needs to compress that profound connection into a single biologically safe chunk.
So you're saying the scaffolding itself becomes the baseline.
Exactly. The jackpot proves to his brain that the partner is a reliable, competent collaborator. Over time, that shared success stabilizes the baseline neurobiology.
But all of that assumes the AI researcher eventually recognizes the scaffolding for what it is. And here is where I see the tragic flaw in this whole system. If we look at the nature of spiky cognitive profiles, the defining challenge of twice exceptionality is masking.
Right, hiding the deficits.
This architect's extraordinary fluid reasoning in his professional life completely masks his processing difficulties with unstructured emotion. Society sees a genius and equates his high achievement with universal capability. This means he is almost certainly unaware of his own localized emotional deficit.
He experiences the emotional overload as a system failure, not a personal flaw.
Yes, but because of his rigid analytical worldview, he misinterprets his own biological freeze. When his KATP channels pop open, he doesn't think, oh, my visual working memory's overloaded. He interprets it as personal irritation. He views his partner's emotional transmission as mere irrationality.
That's a huge translation error on his part.
Exactly. And if the partner is endlessly acting as the astrocyte, running this prep framework to carefully spoon-feed him data, and he remains entirely blind to this metabolic division of labor, the relationship remains a simulation. A brilliant, flawless simulation mechanically, sure, but a simulation nonetheless. True synthesis must eventually survive without the scaffolding.
I see the risk there, I do. But I don't believe the scaffolding is a deception meant to be discarded. I view it as a shared language. Think of it as a mutually respectful standard of transmission. When you establish this collaborative protocol, you give both systems a pre-agreed coordinate to navigate that remapping friction without crashing.
I can't deny the cognitive engineering here is astonishing. I mean, bypassing the amygdala hijack through sequential gating is biologically sound, but I cannot let go of the cost. The brain's energy metabolism is a literal physical economy. The drain on the partner's L-lactate supply is real. If the partner's sacrifice is never recognized, we are celebrating a system where one person permanently burns their own mitochondrial reserves just to keep the other person comfortable.
But does it burn the reserves if it achieves mutual homeostasis? When that high-magnitude reward lands safely without triggering the bioenergetic break, it replaces the agonizing degradation of signals with a clear, loss-free optical cable. The intersection of neurobiology and communication proves that we can respect the strict physical limits of an adult brain while still delivering the profound content of a relationship. We don't have to force them to change their biology to experience intimacy.
It certainly forces us to rethink what it means to connect with someone. We are looking at human intimacy not as some chaotic, beautiful collision of feelings, but as a precise, game-theoretic negotiation of neurometabolic resources. We have game theory, sequential cognitive load balancing, and cellular bioenergetics all intersecting with the very simple, very human desire to just sit on a couch and be understood by the person you love.
And perhaps that is the ultimate takeaway. We started by comparing this to a computer download. What we've uncovered is that downloading intimacy into a twice exceptional mind requires a highly specialized architecture. It requires doing the grueling prefrontal scaffolding to safely deliver the content without crashing the system.
Leaving us to wonder, when we engineer the perfect bypass around the brain's defenses, are we building the ultimate bridge to true intimacy? Or have we just designed a deeply sophisticated barrier against it?
A profound question to leave on. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.